All right, continuing on. We're still in Sagittarius, the Mazzaroth sign of the archer. Remember, I talked a little bit last week on the video about why the Mazzaroth sign for the story of Joshua in the conquered land is represented by an archer. We went back to Jacob's prophecy over the tribe of Joseph in Genesis 49, which says, "But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong, the hands of the mighty hand, or by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel." I also talked a little bit in that video about how the Jews didn't use horses and chariots in warfare. It was something that I just discovered in doing some of the background reading and research that I typically do, although pretty much a lot of the Jews' enemies did use horses and did use chariots in battle. For example, in Exodus 14, it says that Pharaoh took 600 chariots to chase the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. And I was like, that's a number I've read before. But then it just kind of struck me the other day. It's like, that's a lot of chariots. Because you've got horses drawing the chariots, and sometimes in a chariot you actually have two soldiers, right? One to drive and the other one wielding some kind of a weapon. So, and we'll also see a little bit later when we hit Joshua 11 that the coalition of the kings of the north, a very large group that came against the Israelites in battle, all used horses and chariots as well. But the Jews were basically at this point foot soldiers. We also talked about how Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, the Bible refers them to them as 2.5 tribes, right? Because Manasseh was the other half of Ephraim, the two tribes that were split from the tribe of Joseph. Sorry, I'll let my dog out. What? And the fact that even though those 2.5 tribes decided that they wanted land on, it's not really the right term, but on the wrong side of the Jordan, that Moses and Joshua required them to fight with their brothers and sisters until the war was over, however long that could take. And so essentially the families of those 2.5 tribes lived on the other side of the Jordan while all the men of military age went to war with the rest of the nation. And then towards the end, when Joshua said, okay, everyone go back home, they were allowed to go back to their family. We talked about how, just like the Red Sea, the Jordan parted miraculously to allow the Ark of the Covenant, the priest, and then all the tribes to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land. Did anybody remember what time of year it was that the Jews actually crossed towards Jericho? What's that? Passover. Yeah, it was literally 4 days. It was the 10th of Nisan. It was 4 days before Passover. And if I, looking at the numbers, it was literally 41 years almost to the day from the time that they came out of Egypt to when they actually went into the Promised Land. And they celebrated Passover. And the Bible tells us that when they celebrated the Passover in the Promised Land, that's when he stopped giving them manna, because they were able to eat of the produce of the land that they were about to capture. We also saw how God required the men to be circumcised, because the children that were born in captivity had not been circumcised during the years that they wandered. So before he sent them into battle, he required everyone to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant as well. And we also saw how Joshua met with the angel of the Lord, or the angel of the army, the captain of the army of the Lord, which we talked about, some strong language there that really suggests that this was the pre-incarnate Christ, right? Talking about take your shoes off because the land that you stand on, or the ground that you stand on, is holy ground. So at this point in the story, the Jews are about to embark on, what will turn out to be many years of war to remove the inhabitants of the land that God had promised to them. And this, I think, is part of the story of God that makes a lot of unbelievers and non-believers hesitate and maybe question the nature of God. And I've heard people talk about how, the God of the Bible has a split personality, because in the Old Testament, he's, all wrath and vengeance. But in the New Testament, he's like this fluffy, cuddly teddy bear that's all about forgiveness and love, right? And they point that out as if it's some, kind of a contradiction, but it's just because they don't understand the entire story. I've talked before about how nobody really has any right or any grounds to accuse God of being capricious in nature. God has always given his people plenty of instruction. He's given them plenty of warning when something might go wrong or is about to go wrong. He's always very plainly set his expectations. Here are my rules, here are my commandments. Here's what's going to happen, bless you. Here's what will happen if you follow them. Here's what will happen if you don't. But here's a question. Do we have any evidence? This is what I was just saying is about how God has dealt with his people throughout history. He's always plain, he's always upfront, plenty of warning and plenty of patience. But do we have any evidence that God is patient or has been patient in dealing with, particularly in the Old Testament, in dealing with the enemies of Israel? Do we have any evidence that God treats the enemies the same way? That's a question you can answer if you have one, sure.
Yes, before the children of Israel marched into the land, the people there were given 100 years prior to them from the Jews taking the land from the Canaanites, I believe.
The Canaanites? Where do you get the 100 years?
I thought maybe I'm going to another one.
Maybe.
Where they were given 100 years before the land was taken. Maybe that was...
maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, you might be thinking about when God spoke to Abraham and they had that covenant ritual, and he said that they were going to go into bondage for 400 years because the iniquity of the Amorites wasn't complete. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he didn't send them in right away, and I think there was a dual purpose because he was giving the enemies of God time to prove themselves that they were indeed enemies, but there were some things that the Jews had to go through, or the pre-Israelites had to go through as well. So here's the question. Do we have any evidence that God treated the enemies of Israel the same way, or did God just tell the Jews to go and slaughter anyone and everything indiscriminately, as if they were just to satisfy some kind of a bloodlust? Because I think if you talk to some of the critics of God, that's what they will accuse him of, especially when you start looking at how God had the Jews slaughter entire cities or villages, and even in some cases nations. They look at that and go, this is, unjustifiable genocide. So go to Leviticus chapter 18.
I think that if you look at the time when God started bringing the judgments to Pharaoh, he kept giving Pharaoh a chance every single time. Okay, this is going to happen. Let my people go.
Right.
No, it didn't happen. Okay, let's do this. Let's escalate a little bit more. Where you can see where he's always given them opportunities of repentance or to do what he commanded. I mean, God is always going to do that. But you're asking for evidence, so you're going to take us right there. But that's one thing that I can...
Yeah, and that pattern is no different than what we see in the last half of the tribulation, right? That we're talking about in our study time. Yeah, Barry.
If I'm understanding correctly, what about Noah and the flood?
Yeah, how long was Noah building the ark and preaching to the people?
100 years.
100 years, right? He's always giving people a chance. Yeah.
Well, just with God allowing Israel Jews to become Jews, right?
Yeah.
There was a way into the covenant.
That's right.
Even though you weren't born of Abraham.
Yeah. So let's read Leviticus 18:1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt, where you dwelt," and that's a past reference, right? "You shall not do, and according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you," that's a future reference, "you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments, keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You therefore shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." Now, during that year that the Jews were camped at Mount Sinai, after they came out of Egypt, they took them 50 days to get to Sinai, and they were there for a year before they moved again. God was instructing them, and during that period of time, he was very clear where their allegiances should lie, right? And this is where this statement from Leviticus comes. It's from that time. He was, throughout that entire period, instructing them, not just in making the tabernacle and the implements and the priestly robes and all those things. He was teaching them his expectations, right? How to be his people. And his instructions were to not follow the ways of Egypt behind them or the ways of Canaan ahead of them. It was to follow the ways of God who was currently with them, right? Not looking to the past, not looking to the future. But notice what he says there in verse 4. He says, I am the Lord your God. And with what we've come to understand lately with the distinctions between words like Lord and God and deity and divinity, what do you think God is really saying here when he tells them, don't do what they used to do behind you, don't do what you're going to see when you come forward, follow my rules and ordinances, I am the Lord your God. What's he saying? Translate those words for me into a statement or into a concept.
To me, he's telling them, this is what I've told you. If you do that, we'll move forward and you'll be blessed. If you don't, you know the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like you do with your children.
Yep.
You tell them what to do, you expect them to do that, and you move forward.
Right.
Don't be steered to the right or the left, but just stay
straight down the
what
middle.
I've already told you to do.
Yeah, and you see wording like that in different places, right? Don't stray to the left or to the right, but keep going forward. And I think when we see a phrase like "I am the Lord your God," we just kind of gloss over it without really pausing to think, okay, what is he actually saying here? So what does the word Lord mean? Oh, I'm telling Tim on you guys.
Yahweh, the eternal one, Yahweh.
The Lord, I believe this one's in all caps, right?
Yeah.
Right, so it's talking about Jehovah, right? What about the word Lord in small caps? Because it's kind of captured in that as well. Just simply means master, right? Now, what does God mean? Supreme
Sovereign.
authority, right? I am the ultimate sovereign. So he's basically saying you're not going to follow the pattern of the Egyptians. When I bring you into Canaan, don't learn what they're doing. You're not going to follow them. You're going to follow my judgments, right? And if I could read it again, that verse 4, and just put a little bit of emphasis, you shall observe my judgments and my ordinances to walk in them. I am your master and your supreme authority. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement, right? And it's one of those just group of words that we read it, we see it in a lot of places, and we just kind of go, okay, I'm the Lord your God. But it means something very, very specific, particularly in the context of where we are at this part of the story. God is staking a claim, and he is drawing, again, very clear and distinct lines about whom and about what they were to follow. Again, nobody, if they read the Bible, nobody can claim God of being capricious or not preparing his people, right? You just can't validly make that claim. Now skip down to verse 23 for me. In verses 6 to 23, he lists the abominations of the Canaanites, right? He said, don't learn to do as the Canaanites do. And he lists 4 things in verses 6 to 23. He says you're not going to have sex with family members or your close relatives. There's not going to be any child sacrifices. You're not going to worship demons by killing your kids. He says there's not going to be any bestiality. There's not going to be any homosexuality. So he lists the abominations that the Canaanites were actually engaging in. And in verse 24, he says, do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these the nations are defiled, which I am casting out before you. For the land is defiled. Therefore I visit the punishments of its iniquity upon it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants. Now, look at verses 24 and 23, and show me the link between those 2 statements and the promises to Abraham.
Did you ask that question again?
Yeah.
24 and 25.
Yes, 24 and 25.
Okay.
Sorry. What did I say?
23.
All right, I'm just
Animals.
trying to test you. That's all. Yeah, 24 and 25, and pick out for me the connection with those two verses in the Abrahamic covenant. What does the Abrahamic covenant consist of? There's like two promises within it.
The land.
There's a land promise
People.
and a people promise, and that's exactly what he's saying here. He's saying all these things that the Canaanites are doing are defiling the elements of the Abrahamic covenant. Now stop for a second and think, how angry do you think that would make him? The inheritance that he's going to give to his own son is being defiled by the inhabitants of the land that he's bringing the Jews into, right? That's kind of the attitude and the mindset that God's got, the place that he's coming from when he's giving all these instructions to the Jews as they're getting ready to go in and to do battle. Then God states, and we're going to pick up in verse 26, that these rules are not just for the Jews, but as Adam just pointed out, they're also for the stranger who dwells among them. And that's a phrase that you'll see multiple times in the Old Testament, particularly in Deuteronomy as well as the book of Leviticus. And it means these proselytes. It means non-Jews who attach themselves to the nation of Israel and more specifically attach themselves to the Mosaic covenant, right? Because I don't know that it was permissible for someone to just live among the Jews without actually converting to Judaism, right? So they had one set of rules for everyone, for Jews that were natural born, but also for anyone who wanted to convert. So in verse 26, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments and shall not commit any of these abominations that I just listed, either any of your own nation or any stranger who dwells among you. God's tolerance for adopting these pagan abominations extended to the non-Jews that lived as if they were Jews. For all these abominations the men of the land have done, who were before you, and thus the land is defiled, lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. For whoever commits any of these abominations, the persons who commit them shall be cut off from among their people. Therefore you shall keep my ordinance, so that you do not commit any of these abominable customs which were committed before you, and that you do not defile yourselves by them. Again, I am the Lord your God, I am your Lord, I am your master, and I am your supreme authority. Don't get it from anybody else. So the inclusion of these non-Jews who were willing to live under God's law means that it was never God's intent for the Jews to absolutely destroy every single person that they encountered. Because they were allowed to come into the fold, so to speak, right? They had to jump through some hoops, they had to follow some laws, but no law that was any different than any natural born Jew that was under the Mosaic covenant. He was willing to bring these people into the fold. And I think the first and the most obvious group of those strangers who dwell among you were the people of the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. Because remember, as the Jews came out of Egypt after the angel of death visited and killed the firstborn across the land, they didn't come out alone. They came out with a bunch of non-Jewish or Israelite people who recognized the power and the authority of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it talks about this mixed multitude. So of the 2.5 to 3 million people that came out of Egypt and made their way to Mount Sinai, it wasn't all Jewish people. There were some Egyptians, and maybe there were people visiting from other lands that lived there during the plagues and went out with the Jews at the same time. All right, you guys with me? Okay. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 20 here.
Quick question on this.
Sure.
Kind of a side note, but one of the abominations is to, I guess, sleep with your sister or someone close in your family. But
Your aunt,
Yeah, but wasn't that allowed before? Like, when did that change and become an abomination?
I think it was when the law was given.
Okay.
Yeah, it was when the law was given. Can't remember, we went through a story not recently where one of the guys married his father's sister who was his aunt. And it was one of the prominent figures in the stories, and I can't remember which one off the top of my head. But it was after the giving of the law that those things became, taboo, so to speak.
Okay.
Did you say homosexuality was one of the things that they did?
Yeah, so it talks about not lying with a man as if he was a woman. Yeah. All right, this is Deuteronomy 20 now. Moses is, again, Deuteronomy, the second law, it's Moses' speech to the second generation, the people who eventually would go into the promised land. He's telling these people what to expect as they go into the promised land under Joshua's leadership, because remember, Moses was not allowed to go in. And he begins now to define the rules or the conditions of war and the rules of engagement, right? It's not like God just unleashed a Jewish army on the people. Like he sat them down and he said, okay, here's how we're going to behave. We're going to go in and we're going to take the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we're going to do it in a very specific way. So Deuteronomy 20, verse 1, when you go out to battle against your enemies and you see horses and chariots, and there's back to that idea of the Jews didn't use chariots in war, and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now, this is kind of like another Kadesh Barnea moment, isn't it? Remember in Kadesh Barnea, they sent the 12 spies in, and 10 of them came back and said, oh, they live in walled cities, and they're really big, and they're fearsome, so we're not going to go in. Well, guess what? This generation had the same choice. Except this time, they're not going in just necessarily against, what they could see within maybe a 40-day journey or a 20-day journey. They know that these people had chariots of iron and horses. They had mounted militia. They could have made the same choice that their parents had made, but they didn't. They trusted God, right? So he says, don't be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So it shall be when you are on the verge of battle, that the priest shall approach and speak to the people, and he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint, do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them, for the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Remember the story where God said, I'm not going to go with you because you're stubborn and stiff-necked. I'm going to send my messenger. And Moses pleaded, and God said, okay, I'll go with you personally. All right, this kind of going back to the same concept is that the Lord himself was involved in these battles. In verses 5 through 9, we see some allowances. God allowed some of the Jewish warriors to stay home if they had just built a new house and hadn't moved in yet, if they had just planted a vineyard and hadn't reaped any of the harvest, if they were betrothed but were not yet married, or if they just simply didn't have a heart for war. Talks about the Hebrew Old Testament in the English translation talks about if you're faint-hearted, you don't have to go to war. Septuagint is a little bit more blunt. If you're a coward, I don't want you there. And the second half of that verse basically says, lest the other soldiers take on your attitude. Like literally, Moses' instructions from God were, if you're a coward, I don't want you out in the battle, because when you faint and panic, I don't want everyone else doing the same thing. So he was being very specific about among all the warriors he could send. He made allowances for some people in certain circumstances and parts of life, but he didn't want the faint of heart out on the battlefield. Didn't want them.
Another question.
Yeah.
Your question, going back to that, you're asking, did God give the nations a chance?
Yep.
So before they would go into these battles, is this like kind of like Braveheart where they go out and meet first? Like,
Yes.
I'm saying, like,
Yeah.
So maybe they were even given another chance then, like, the God of Israel says this, and then the king says, no, we're not going to do that.
All right. So pick it up in verse 10, because we're right there.
Oh, okay.
We're right on it. So notice God's instructions, right? His instructions are first offer peace. Verse 10, he says, when you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it.
Oh, okay.
And this goes back to what I was saying before, is that God was not just unleashing, this holy army to go and devastate. He didn't necessarily want that, except a couple of circumstances which we'll get to. He was instructing them to go in and to take the land by peace if possible. So first proclaim an offer of peace, and it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, or are open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. So go and bring your army, bring the Ark of the Covenant, be ready for war, but see if they'll lay down their arms first. Now, here's my question, where it says, then all the people who are found in it, if they accept the offer of peace, they shall be placed under tribute. What does that mean? Does he mean to enslave everyone?
Have to give them their goods.
Give them their goods? You know, and again, I'm just trying to draw off some of the things that conversations I've had with people who are unbelievers that are critics of the Bible, critics of God and his character. It's almost like they've seen too many either historical, like epic battle movies, or if they've seen too many sci-fi things where if you say no to an offer of peace, we're just going to mow you down. Or we're just going to go in and we're going to kill everyone without offering peace first. But this whole idea of tribute, tributarianism, if that's a word, if not, I just made it up, basically was a system where one group exerts political or economic or military power over another group. And the ruling state allows the tributary state to live and function in relative peace, but as a subordinate. And they always had to follow rules and conditions. And in fact, this was kind of like the ongoing status of the Jewish nation after they were allowed to come back from captivity. And they were, subjugated to all of the major nations, right? Babylon, they were in captivity, but back in Israel, they were under tribute. Same thing with the Persians for a while, but certainly Greeks and under Rome, they owed their allegiance to Rome because they were a much larger, much stronger nation or empire. And the tribute was paid in several different ways. It could be a monetary tribute where a subservient country had to give gold or silver. Sometimes it was agricultural. They might have to give grain. They might have to give cattle and that kind of stuff. Sometimes it was a people tribute. Sometimes they just had to give a whole bunch of people to serve as a workforce. We might call that slavery, but it's not the kind of slavery that we think about in modern times. But it also could be a military tribute. Some nations or states that were conquered had to send their men to fight in the army for the ruling country or the ruling power. But sometimes the tribute was symbolic. Anybody see the movie The Maltese Falcon?
A long time ago.
Long time ago, right? It was like from the 50s, I think it was.
Black and white movie.
Yeah. So anyways, in The Maltese Falcon, this was Humphrey Bogart, right? The whole thrust of the movie is that the Maltese Falcon was a statue of a falcon that was encrusted in jewels, and it was stolen or lost, and everybody was trying to find it. And this was really kind of the basis of the movie. But this Maltese Falcon was based on historical fact, not necessarily saying that there was a jewel-encrusted falcon, but back in the early to mid-1500s, King Charles V of Spain, who was also the Emperor of Rome, granted authority and lands to the Order of the Knights of the Hospitallers. It was kind of like around the time when you had the Knights Templar and you had Christians that were on pilgrimage to Israel. The Hospitallers were initially an order of knights that were supposed to help them with medical aid to keep them safe on the road in their pilgrimage. But the Grand Master of the Order of the Knights of Hospitaller every year had to send a single falcon to King Charles V of Spain, who again was also the Emperor of Rome. And that was a symbolic gesture that says, yes, we continue to exist and survive and perhaps even thrive under the word would be hegemony, or under your authority and under your rule. And so this is part of what the Jews were doing as they were going into the promised land that Joshua was doing, is that they would first offer peace. And if whoever they was, a city or a village or whatever, if they were willing to live peacefully with the Jews, they would owe the Jews tribute. And that was it. That was the end of it. There was no war. There was no destruction. But what happened if they refused? They were told to kill everyone. So if we continue on here in verse 12, the choice that God gave these people was join us or suffer the consequences. Verse 12, now if the city will not make peace with you, but war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, you shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword. But the women, the little ones, the livestock, and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall plunder for yourself, and you shall eat the enemy's plunder which the Lord your God gives you. So here's the sequence. Offer peace, and if they say yes, then they become your tributaries. If they say no and war against you, kill all of the military male combatants, but preserve the women, the children, the livestock, and the goods, all the booty, and it becomes yours. Now that is a slightly different picture, I think, than what most critics of God in the Bible would paint. Right? They would paint God as this wrathful, vengeful, capricious murderer without justification or cause. Right? But I don't think we can justify that, or we can't say
Aren't
that.
there other battles where God says to kill the women and children?
Yeah, we're getting there.
Okay.
Yeah. It's all part of my master plan today. Now, this last statement in verse 15, I don't think I read it. No, I didn't. Let me read verse 15 for you. It says, "Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations." So it would appear that, like, within the boundaries of the promised land, which, remember, is pretty big, right? Goes all the way from the Nile in the west in Egypt to the Euphrates in the east towards Mesopotamia, and then, of course, it ranges north and south. It seems that the nomads and the people who dwelt in cities and in villages in the outlying areas that weren't kind of in the area that would later become known as Jerusalem and Israel proper, that the people who lived on the outskirts were treated a little bit differently than those who lived in and around Canaan proper, in the midst of what later is called Israel, as part of 7 nations that God had a particular issue with. Because he said in verse 15, he said, "Thus you shall do to all the cities which are far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations." Now, what nations are they? Let's go back to Genesis chapter 15. Keep your finger here because we're going to come back. Genesis 15. The context here is God is about to enact that covenant ritual with Abraham where he had him take a bunch of animals and split them in half and take some birds. Genesis 15:12. "Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, horror, great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abraham, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years." Right? And that's talking about the time of affliction from the birth of Isaac all the way to the point where they came out of Egypt. "Also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You should be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Again, God was giving this group of people called the Amorites plenty of time to either respond to him or to prove that he was their enemies, or he was their enemy. And it was at least a 400-year period. In fact, it was longer than that, because now when we're reading a little bit later in Joshua, we're 41 years or so after these statements were made. So we're talking about 450 years, pretty close to it. It's an awful lot of time for God to give a group of people a chance to prove themselves one way or another. Verse 17, "And it came to pass when the sun went down, the torch, the burning like the oven." So verse 18, "On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites," and notice these names now, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now there's more than 7 nations there, but when you read some of the scholarly comment, some of these nations, for example, the Girgashites, or even the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, were considered to be subcomponents of larger groups, for example, like the Canaanites or the Amorites. The problem that God had with these people was not simply because they occupied the land that he wanted for his people. It was because these nations practiced the abominations that he listed that defiled the land, defiled the people. These were the ones that were worshiping demons and killing their children, like child sacrifice, and bestiality and all the things that God said. No, this defiles everything that I hold dear. And throughout the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy and a little bit in Joshua and later Judges, God keeps listing the same nations, the same 7 nations. So go back now to Genesis 20, where we just were. In verse 16, but of the cities of these people, which the Lord your God gives to you as an inheritance, you shall not let anything that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations, which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. You sin against me, your master, your supreme authority. So here's a question again, or the same question. Was God acting like a raging, vindictive monster when he sent his people into war in the Promised Land? Or do we see these rules of engagement? Do we see God seeking peace when it was possible, but acting with justice when it was necessary? That's exactly the picture that we see. These 7 same nations are mentioned earlier in Deuteronomy 7 with the same instruction. I'm just going to read a couple of verses. You shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You won't give your daughter to their son, or take another daughter for your son, but thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord, in verse 7, this is Deuteronomy 7:7, the Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples, but because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers. The Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh of Egypt the king of Egypt. Therefore know that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commandments. And he repays those who hate him to their face, to destroy them. He will not be slack with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. Now, did God give the Amorites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Girgashites, did he give them plenty of time to prove that they hated him? Plenty of time. Almost 500 years of time. Here's something interesting. We all know that we inherit our genes from our parents, right? So there's this field of genetics, and in the last, I think from about the 1960s on, there's this new field of research and science called epigenetics. So the genetics is basically what your genes are, what genes you have, and we get those from our parents. The field of epigenetics is the things that influence our genes. For example, our environment, the decisions that we make with diet and lifestyle, the food that we eat, how we manage stress, the choices we make actually influence how our genes behave. What science has told us in about the last 5 to 7 years is that if I make choices with diet and lifestyle and I live a crappy life and I'm stressed and I never manage my stress and get rid of things that are stressing me out, that changes my genes, and the modification of my genes gets passed on to my kids. So you not only inherit your genes, but you inherit the impact of your life, your lifestyle, your thought patterns. We know, for example, here's another example, is that the majority of violent crimes are committed by a small number of people who are habitual criminals. And there are genes that control anger and aggression. And current estimates are that about 50% of repetitive aggression and anger problems are actually genetically based. So there are people who will always be angry and aggressive because it's their gene profile. Now, these these nations that you see up on the screen here, right? The Perizzites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, etc. Does anybody know from whom they are descended? And you're right on the money. Go to Genesis 9:25. Genesis 9:25.
What are you talking about? Noah?
Nope.
I mean, not Noah. I mean,
You're like one person away when you said Ham, but you're all right. Genesis 9:25. Then he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren." Remember the story in Genesis when they came, got onto dry land after the flood. Noah got drunk, and Ham went in and saw his father naked and made fun of him. And then Noah pronounced this curse on Canaan, and we're like, well, Canaan was Ham's son. Why did he curse Canaan? Look at Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 gives us the genealogies of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and the nations that came out of that. Genesis 10:15. Canaan begot Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, and then he names a few more that we don't typically see as we go throughout the Bible. The nations that God had a problem with are the nations that were descended from Ham and Canaan, who were specifically cursed. And I think what we're seeing is we start to see kind of a picture come together, right? We see how all these little pieces link. Is that, first of all, God is not random. He's not unstable. He's not schizophrenic. He doesn't have split personalities. He's graceful. He's patient. He's long-suffering. He's clear in his expectations. He gives people opportunity. He's direct in his communication about consequences for either obedience or disobedience. And he communicates these things well ahead of time. He's also fair in war. He seeks peace when there is opportunity, but he's swift and he's complete in his judgment when it is justified. And he's undeterred in fulfilling his word and fulfilling his promises, particularly the ones that he gave to Abraham and to his seed. So the nations, these 7 nations that God was preparing his people to go out and fight against, the ones that he was going to give no quarter to, he gave them no quarter because they proved definitively, without a doubt, over centuries that they were his enemies. So there are cultural arguments as to why God would have done this. If you grow up in a family and in a community and in a nation that prized demon worship and doing so killing your babies, and you're having sex with animals, do we want that to continue? Do you think God wanted that to be perpetuated, at least from a cultural standpoint, but now from our scientific understanding, knowing that thought patterns and those behaviors are ingrained in your DNA and they get passed on genetically? That's crazy stuff. I start to look at the account and the record. There are many reasons why God wrote all these things down, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that God is proving definitively for anyone who would bother to objectively look at the evidence, he is proving definitively that he has every right to make the judgments that he's made. And when people stand before the throne, whether it's the judgment seat of Christ or the great white throne judgment, which will involve the non-believers, nobody has the right to claim that he's being unfair and unjust. And he set it all up thousands and thousands of years ago in the instructions that he gave to his people, even going under Joshua into the conquered land. Boggles my mind how complete and how thorough and how detailed he is. Questions? If you're like me, my stomach is rumbling right now. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Wouldn't you think, okay, you started, looks like with the Amorites because they went in through Jericho. Wouldn't you think the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Hivites or all those guys out there would say, oh, look what these people are doing once they come in the land. And if we aren't if we don't make peace with them, they're going to destroy us. They didn't even learn from any of that.
Some of them did. So the next time we talk, and this will be our last lesson in Sagittarius, we'll look at the deception of the Gibeonites, and we'll look at how the kings of the south and the kings of the north at different times made these coalitions to fight against the nations because they saw what the Jews were doing. They were coming in and they were, kicking butt and taking names. But they were doing it the way that God defined it. They were giving people an opportunity, but he had no, how does he say it here? He says he will not, I can't find it quickly, but, he will give no quarter to those who have proved with absolute certainty that they are his enemies. Yeah.
But can't you say that we see that same thing now, like over in Jerusalem now? We'll see pictures of homosexuals and you name it carrying on over there. And then if you look even into our country, how we have homosexuals and abortion and the whole 9 yards.
And I see abortion as human sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's human sacrifice at the altar of hedonism and humanism. Right? I don't think it's changed at all. Yeah, Jennifer.
You say about the epigenetics that can inherit. Well, then now I can see why homosexuals say, "Well, I'm born this way."
Yeah.
Because of their parents.
Yeah, they still have never. They've not identified genes that are involved in homosexuality, to my understanding.
Yeah.
They've proven just the opposite.
Not have his mother.
Yeah, I think there are a whole bunch of other influences, but you look at, just to refocus the conversation back on Revelation and the state of affairs that we'll see in the last 3.5 years, you see the same story playing out over and over again, right? It's the rebellion. It's the, I'm going to do it my way. It's the refusal to bow to the master, the sovereign authority, the ultimate authority, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the creator of the universe. I mean, it takes, a lot of people, again, critics of Christianity and the Bible, will try to make it about an intelligence problem or, some kind of a weakness. Like you're weak-minded, you need a crutch. So you invent this fairy tale God in the sky who, is in control of all things. But it's not an intelligence issue. You look back, some of the most intelligent people in history were Christians. They were believers. Whether you go back to some of the old scientists. Lots of scientists, like, I've shown you some of the archaeology and astrophysics stuff. People who have double PhDs, people who are astrophysicists, people who are research biochemists. So you can't say that believing versus not believing is a problem of a lack of intelligence or an abundance of it. It's a heart issue. It's a humility issue. It's a pride problem.